with us this morning with Bill Lemman, who has played several interesting roles in the history of Portland State over time. And I think beginning in Vanport, the very first class, back in what, 1946?
Yes.
I'd like you to go back there and just give us a brief summary kind of what the atmosphere was in this school that basically was a continuation center, maybe the first 2 years, sort of an early community college type place in Vanport, Portland, which was the site of housing for people who worked in the shipyards during World War II. What
Right.
was the campus like, and the students, most of whom were fresh out of World War II?
That's what it was like. Of course, as you suggest, the Vanport city was indeed a city. I think there were some 25,000 or so people there, so there were grocery stores and a bank and a barber shop and other kinds of commercial facilities that one would expect in a community of that size. And so when the shipyard closed, or shipyards, plural, closed, and people began to leave, those businesses went out of business, so to speak, and became just empty buildings. So when the college started in the summer of 46, I was not there at that point, but there were a few hundred people there. They just started by putting regular college desk chairs in those rooms in various places, and of course some minor remodeling was done to make them habitable and make rooms out of areas that were in previously a large grocery store, for example. And then tables, and one of those became our library and so on. So all of these kind of strange buildings became the campus. And I have no idea what proportion of students lived there, but a number of them did, as well as a lot of the faculty had departments there. And so there was enough activity to make it feel a little bit like a campus. There are many student dances and other kinds of art exhibits and things of that nature that made it feel somewhat like a college. I had my freshman year at Texas A&M in 1942-43 before I went in the Marine Corps, and so I had a genuine campus experience. Although that was a man's college in those days, and a military school, so we were all in uniform at that point. Anyway, it was quite different from that. On the other hand, everyone seemed to enjoy it, and we were all adults, even if we're only 19 or 20 or 21 at that point, and so it had a good feeling.
And the key person in the establishment of that place and over the next few years was a man named Stephen Epler.
Yes.
And I know you worked with him quite often and became very close with him. Can you talk a little bit about his role in Portland State?
Well, it was his idea. He was a counselor at Southern Oregon State College, I guess it was in those days, and he had been discharged from the Navy. He had his doctorate from Columbia, so he was already well into the educational stream, but as was my case, I could not get back into Texas A&M because my parents had moved to Oregon during the war, and we were no longer residents. And so we could, same here, in Oregon, you could only get into one of the public institutions if you were an Oregon resident,
Wow.
or had been.
Before the advent of out-of-state tuition,
Correct.
obviously.
And so the dorms and the housing available on those campuses immediately filled because of all the returning vets who had some had no college and some had, like me, 1 or 2 or 3 years. So Steve's idea was to bring the college to the housing rather than try to build housing on the existing campuses, because there were all of those empty apartment buildings. How he discovered that, I don't know, I don't recall. But he persuaded the then dean of the General Extension Division, John Francis Kramer, to go ahead with that experiment. And he started hiring faculty in the summer of 1946 and opened it up. So a large number of the faculty were also returning vets. For example, my mentor and accounting prof was Don Parker. He had graduated from Linfield and then gone on to get a master's degree at Northwestern before he went in the Navy. So when he came out, he already had his second degree. So there are a number of folks like that who were recruited as faculty members, and some older folks that were hired from other institutions. So it was, in a sense, a community college, but without the technical and vocational kinds of courses, just strictly university level courses, all from catalogs of mostly Oregon State, and Western for the education courses.
So the campus was there for just about 2 years
Yes.
when the dikes on the Columbia River gave way.
Actually, they weren't dikes, they were levees.
Oh.
And that was part of the problem,
I
because
see.
people thought they were dikes. It was just a railroad levee and not built as a dike to withhold water from the Columbia at a flood stage.
I do recall, though, that the proper authorities, whoever they were,
Oh, yes.
said, don't worry about
No
this.
worries, it'll hold.
Apparently not.
Apparently not.
But you didn't live on the campus.
No.
But you went there after the flood. There must have been a tremendous cleanup effort that went on.
Well, the campus community was really 60% or more convinced that there would be a dike break or a levee break. And so I, among many others, started helping haul library books and records and things like that off campus
Before the flood.
before the flood. But that didn't happen to people who lived there. They stayed, and one of my favorite stories is that Philip Putnam, who was the assistant director under Steve Epler, had been working on his dissertation, and the flood came and he got washed out, and he remembered that his dissertation was on his desk on the second floor, and he found a rowboat, rowed up to the window on the second floor, got in, got his dissertation draft that all of his papers were working on, rowed back out. It was that kind of a situation. And then, of course, it was strange to see up on Interstate Avenue tables like this stretched out for 2 or 3 blocks in the middle of the street with food and clothing. And here's my favorite literature professor, Ella Litchfield, pawing through a bunch of old clothes trying to find something to wear because she had been living there and it was gone. So it was like really weird in that respect.
So 1948 was a year that the campus got wiped out, but oddly enough, it was the same year that the legislature decided to make this a permanent school, not a college, but a permanent lower division school.
Correct.
Thanks largely to the efforts of a student, John Hawkinson.
Yes.
Can you talk about John?
I know him not well, but I knew him a lot later as an alum, and he became president of Viking Community College, among other things. But he was just like many of the rest of us who thought and knew that this was the largest metropolitan area in the country without a public four-year college. And so those of us who didn't have the wherewithal or GI Bill to help us through the financial part of it, couldn't go to a private school or perhaps even move to one of the other institutions. So there was a large number of students and faculty and other community members, parents, who wanted to make it permanent, but John was bright enough and thoughtful enough and skillful enough to actually draft a bill and sell it to some local legislative folks who would sponsor the legislation.
And it passed.
And it passed.
And then the campus moved around a bit since it had been flooded out to, I think they met at Grant High School that summer.
That summer, 48.
And back to the shipyards.
Oregon Shipyard.
And then in 1952, jumping ahead, you had gone back to University of Oregon to get your degree.
Yeah, for 48, 49, just 1 year left.
And then you came to Portland to find your fortune. And Steve Epler contacted you again to come back, is that right?
Yes.
So tell us, how did that come about?
I'm not exactly sure, but my guess is that my friend Don Parker, who was I was an accounting major at that point, probably responded to Steve. They were golfing buddies. Don and Steve played a lot of golf among 2 or 3 other faculty members. And Steve knew that he wanted needed an assistant business manager to help staffing that area as the college grew. And my guess is that he was talking to Don about, do you know anybody, et cetera. And Steve made friends with students very easily and often took the initiative to introduce himself, and so it wasn't hard to get to know him at all. But anyway, he did call and ask if I would be interested in that, and I was, and we settled on that, so that's how I got that position.
And one of the things that was interesting to me is that student records and all of that sort of thing at that point were held by the University of Oregon.
Yes.
I mean, so in essence, nothing really existed at Portland State except for
Well, that's historical in that the General Extension Division, which by its name meant that it was extending educational opportunities off campus, mainly in the Portland Extension Center, which was a night program, actually using Lincoln High School downtown, and also correspondence courses and things of that sort. And so they, in order to not have to have a registrar separate from an institution, back in the 1929 or 30 era, started using University of Oregon as the house the academic records of the Extension Division. And of course, Vanport Extension Center was part of the General Extension Division of the university system. So it made sense for them to have custody of the records because they were experienced. So we on the campus designed our own registration system and method of making cards for classes and grades and so on. Then we'd send them down to the University of Oregon for recording so that you got a transcript just like a U of O student, except it said General Extension Division on it and listed the courses and grades and hours and so on.
So when you explain how you guys figured out you could get into Lincoln High School, which the school board at that point had said, this building is not adequate for a high school, but I guess it's adequate enough for a college? I mean,
the Portland School District was the one who made that decision and built the new Lincoln High School up by what was then Multnomah Stadium.
right.
And that's still where they are.
1952.
And so we were looking for a more sophisticated and permanent location, I guess, than clapboard buildings that were used for housing shipboard offices. And I was not part of that discussion at all, but it didn't take us long to adopt that phrase. It was not good enough for a high school, so the Board of Higher Education bought it for a college. So we had that one square block and plus the tennis court across the street. And of course, we didn't need a tennis court, says the board. We can sell that for $60,000, and they did, so the AAA building is there now. And it would take probably $3 million or so to buy it. I don't know, maybe more than that.
So that's what was on that block, were the tennis courts.
Yes.
When you moved into Lincoln, at least it had the feeling of a place
Yes.
that was dedicated. So what was kind of the feeling among staff and students too, I guess, about the future of this 2-year school, basically, at that time?
We were actually looking for other places. Among other locations would be where the Portland Community College is up at, what is it, Mount Sylvania or whatever?
Oh, yes. That's Sylvania campus.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was one of the locations we looked at, but it was too expensive or too far away or something, I'm not sure. But we were always looking for ways to expand, to have additional facilities. And the Board of Higher Education, the Chancellor's office actually, hired a man named Will Norris, who was a professor of physics at the University of Oregon. I think he was chair of their campus planning committee. He asked him to come up for a couple of months and design a long-term campus plan, long-range campus plan. And he did, and it consisted of Lincoln High School, and then 3 blocks to the south, which now is where Kramer Hall, the Student Center, and Newberger Hall are. And so his design was to have 4 or 5-story buildings on each of those blocks, and then have a 7-story tower over half, the center half, or you take a quarter off of this, quarter off of that, and a 7-story tower over that whole work, or over the student center part, and resting half on Streamer and half
Wow.
on Newburger Hall. That was and there are pictures of it. I don't know if you have them around or not, but I'm sure we can get them if you're.
That would have been something.
Yes, but that was his, and that was going to take care of, I don't know, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 students. So was the plan at that point.
When did the lobbying for permanent 4-year status, degree granting, that was all in the early 50s, obviously?
Oh, yes, it was continuous.
And that was going on at the same time?
Exactly.
Who were the standard bearers in that? Was that Epler again, or Kramer?
Not Mr. Kramer was the dean of the extension division, and his instructions from the chancellor's office were not to push expansion. The board was very reluctant because I think they thought it would take resources and students away from that would have otherwise gone to the existing campuses, and that building a new campus would be expensive, et cetera. So that was never a foresight of anyone in that hierarchy. So it was mostly Steve Epler and other administrators and faculty and students and parents. And that just continued year by year until it happened.
1955, I guess the legislation actually said it shall be a city college and it specifically prohibited housing. Is that?
My memory on the words are, it's to be I don't recall, I don't think it said urban, I think it said a downtown city college and not of the campus type. Those were code words for no residence halls, no dormitories. And that was expressly put in by the chancellor's office to
No doubt at the behest of Oregon and Oregon State, I assume.
I can't answer that.
Well, that's all right.
I have opinions about it, but I don't know.
What, well, that was just after Kramer made his famous accordion speech. Could you tell us about the accordion speech?
It was, well, the notion was that when Dean Kramer approved the establishment of Vanport Extension Center, that was going to be temporary and bringing overflow students, so to speak, to this housing project, and that when the overflow diminished, that so would the campus. And so he described it as being an accordion, that we would expand it when the students were there, and when the students started to disappear, and then the campus would close. So that was his mental perception and strategic plan for the institution.
And then it must have come as somewhat of a surprise when the 4-year institution was authorized that the first president was the accordionist himself rather than Steve Epler. And even to this day, there still are people who resent that.
Oh yes, I think there was, most everyone, can put it that way, expected that Steve had a doctor's degree, just like in education, just like Jack Kramer did, and that there was no reason And the expectation was that he would become the president, because he was the founder and the person who had guided the whole development of the institution. But Mr. Kramer decided that it wasn't so bad after all, I guess, and that maybe this was a better future for a person with his background and experience, and that, of course, having been the person who had direct reporting to the Board of Higher Education and the Chancellor, he had the inside track. This was before affirmative action. And I don't know anything about the actual decision-making process at that time, but that's what happened. I think the inferences are pretty clear.
So you were in the business office at Portland State for most of that time, right? When?
Yes, 50 to 56, 1950 to 56.
And where did you go in 56?
I'd been asked by people in the Chancellor's office if I would be interested in going to Oregon State. They had a vacancy in the fiscal officer for the Ag Experiment Station and the College of Agriculture. At that time, those two budgets were larger than Portland State's.
Well, we didn't have any farms.
That's correct, because it had branch stations and all the other things. But anyway, it became an attractive thing for us and a step up for me, and so I decided to take it. So I did that and was there for 3.5 years until President Millar came down one day and talked to me about returning.
How do you suppose that came about? Some friends of yours who were here, and President Millar was looking for help, and they said, well, talk to Bill Lemman.
No, again, I can't get into their specific minds, but the business manager was Leslie Newhouse. He was the one who was business manager when I was hired in 1950, or shortly thereafter, maybe within 6 months. So he had been there all this time, and he had wanted to become he had wanted an opportunity to go to a embassy in the Caribbean for a year as a business officer of some sort, and he'd had that as a dream kind of for a long while, and he had an opportunity presented to him for that in, I guess, late 55 or early 56, and so he asked President Millar for a leave of absence. Well, Brand Millar had just been there a few months, and he said, I can't come here and have my chief business officer leave for a year when I'm trying to learn all that was going on. And so Mr. Newhouse says, okay, I quit. And so he did, and went to forgotten where it was, one of the Caribbean nations. And so Brand and Jack Swarthout, who was the dean of faculty, who knew me because I'd been there before, came down to Oregon State and talked to me about taking that position. So that was a no-brainer for me.
Out of the farms and back to the city?
There you go.
So you came back in 1959,
Yes.
just really at the beginning of Branford Millar's presidency. The next 6 or 8 years were basically pivotal, really pivotal in the development of this institution. And I'd like to go back and talk about Dr. Millard's influence and some of the major changes that came about on campus during those early sixties, in fact, the whole decade of the sixties. It must have been exciting to come here.
Oh, yeah, in those days, because we were growing 10, 12, 15% a year. And just struggling to find space, buying a house here and there or something, and getting a quarter of a block building here and a quarter of a block building there, because, again, the Board of Higher Education was not used to giving high priority to this institution. So Brand agreed to hire Skidmore's and Merrill Portland office to do a long-range plan for the Portland State College, or we weren't thinking university at that point, but we just become a college. And we did. That office had done the Air Force Academy out of their Chicago office, and we were able to get one of those people onto the Portland staff and designed a campus plan which incorporated going west of the park blocks and having a series of walkways and so on through the park blocks. And we created a model, a physical model for it, and that was photographed. I don't know if you have that in your archives, but if not, I think I have one somewhere. It was on the front page of the Oregon Journal, I think, at that time. Branford and I were standing looking at the model with an architect, and it said, PSU plans for 20,000 students at the top. And everybody was saying, ha, ha, ha. You know?
Right.
So that.
Well, for people who weren't here during those years and who have experienced trying to find rooms in Kramer Hall, the reason those floors all seem strange is that that building was built in at least 4 different pieces, and so the third floor isn't always the third floor, and the first floor isn't always the basement, or vice versa. And that's the way this campus, main campus, was developed.
Well, it started, that's correct. They were built in pieces. I think probably Newberger Hall was the first building that was built in toto, but even the Smith Center was built in 2 stories and then added another 2 stories several years later. And those were built with the idea of those expansions at the time, so it wasn't as if they were unplanned. On the other hand, it's a lot more costly to do it that way.
An exciting thing happened in the late 60s, probably beginning in the mid 60s, and you played a key role in this, was the urban renewal legislation, federal urban renewal legislation, which basically provided for the major expansion of this campus beyond these 4 blocks downtown.
Yes.
Once you're slaked your thirst, I'd like you to tell that story, because it's very interesting the way a small group here in Portland took advantage of that particular legislation in Portland State's favor.
I was engaged with the Western and then National Association of College University Business Officers, a professional organization. And I had gone to a seminar at Wayne State University in Detroit about urban renewal for college and universities. The background is that urban renewal, as it had up to that time, was to be used to clear dilapidated, or that was one of their terms, housing or areas, and convert them to commercial or housing, but not for other purposes. And a man named Julian Levy was an attorney with the University of Chicago. His brother later became president of the University of Chicago. But anyway, he was on the staff there, and the University of Chicago was trying to expand, and they were landlocked. They were blocked in by tenement apartments and some other things that were not very good, and they didn't have the power of eminent domain. They're a private institution, and so they couldn't just force people to sell. So he and some others lobbied the Congress to amend the Urban Renewal Act to permit properties acquired in that manner to be sold to colleges, universities, and hospitals. So that's where I learned of that. I have a fond memory of that because it was in a new little small auditorium there at Wayne State that had been done by Minoru Yamasaki, was the architect. It was just a little jewel. And that was one of my first trips back east for business anyway. So I came back and talked to Brand about this, and we were buying these old houses as we could around campus, particularly right on Broadway where Smith Center is. And so we employed a young man named Dick Soderberg that we found in Southern Oregon. He was affiliated with, I think it was Medford Urban Renewal. And he came up and did what he called a windshield survey, just walking and riding around the area to see what was there and the status of it in terms of its long-term use, houses or commercial buildings, and decided that he thought it would qualify. So we designed a little project and took it down to the Urban Renewal HC, the Portland Development Commission. John Kenward was the director at that time. And I remember talking to him about it, and he thought, well, it has possibilities, but we're really busy with this South Auditorium project, and really didn't want to get involved at this point. So we kept working on them, and finally I was given the opportunity to make a presentation to the Development Commission. It was chaired by Ira Keller in those days. And so I did, and they decided that maybe it was okay. So then we made the application through HUD for a project.
That's housing and urban.
Housing and urban development. I guess it was still HUD in those days, I can't remember.
So. I think so.
But it was going to be approved. And it would provide $5 or $7 million, I think, for acquisition, but we had to match it with $5 million, which, where's that? And so Brand and I went down to a legislative subcommittee hearing, and really couldn't get a formal hearing on it, so we talked, I think his name was Gene Lewis. Does that ring a bell at all? legislator in the Ways and Means. And we did our little chalkboard presentation about how this could work. And they really were thrilled with it. And lo and behold, 5 million came up in Ways and Means. And so that was 1965, maybe.
5, 6,
Yeah, along in there. And so the board did permit us to, in 1964, I pulled that out because I couldn't remember, they did approve the project as a concept, and it would require almost 30 acres along where the boundaries are. And then that was, that other thing came, the other project was approved was formally approved in March of 1965. So then, when that was signed by the Urban Renewal Commission, the Portland Development Commission, then they started acquiring property and demolishing. That was part of it. Everything had to be demolished to bare land, and that was part of the budget. So off we went.
And as I recall, at that time, there were a lot of private homes or houses in this area.
Oh, yeah, it was
and
all-
also apartment houses. And that requirement of demolition spurred the push for student housing in a really interesting fashion to me, which is another movement that was pushed by students here. Could you talk about how you managed to save several apartment houses that still are student housing today?
Well, there are two parts to that story.
Good.
One is a student named Stan Amy, who is now well known in the community because he started Natural Foods or
Natures
or something like that. Came to my office in this old house on Park Blocks where the business office was in those days, and wanted to talk because he was having problems with his housing just a few blocks from here. And we talked quite a while, and he thought that he could organize a group to get some private housing going. And he did. Our names are going to start failing me now. One of the persons key to that was president or one of the chief administrators of Blitz Weinhardt Brewery
Oh,
downtown. But anyway, the upshot of it was they organized Portland Student Services, incorporated it. And in those days, the HUD would give a $3 million low-interest loan to any institution for student housing. And of course, we had the prohibition in the statute at that point. So I inquired if that could be assigned and learned that it could. And so we assigned that $3 million federal loan to Portland Student Services, and they built the Goose Hollow Inn out of that, Goose Hollow Lodging, whatever they call it, residence hall. So that's one part of how that part started. In the other, as you suggest, there were some apartment houses that were framed. They were just two or 3 stories, but we had several brick ones that are 3 or 4 stories, like the Blackstone and some others that are right here. I think 7 or 8 of them. And so, having persuaded the federal government that this place was so dilapidated, it all had to be demolished, John Kenward, Portland Development Commission executive director, and his attorney, Oliver North, and I went down to San Francisco regional office and persuaded HUD to let us keep those 7 or 8 buildings and contractually, we had to sign that we would bear the cost of demolition, and not, rather than it being absorbed by the urban renewal project. And so that got taken care of, and we then found ourselves with 7 or 8 apartments.
And who,
And Portland, excuse me, go ahead.
Portland Student Services ran those then, or?
I can't recall.
Because the
Sure.
this college could not do it, right?
Well, I couldn't build a residence hall,
Ah.
but we had the buildings, and they looked the other way.
And so we had the development basically of what you would call the Broadway campus. And then when did we vacate the park blocks and
The streets.
Yes.
I really don't recall in there. It was in that era, but I really don't recall the exact dates. But there were a number of things that went into that. First, we needed to put those bridges between Lincoln Hall and Kramer and so on.
Sky bridges.
Sky bridges. And the city, oh no, liability, somebody might fall onto our street and sue us. Well, we can solve that and vacate the street.
So it's okay if they fall on your property, right?
And so that's how that started.
Jeez. Well,
And then we had a big fuss about making curb cuts for the sidewalks to go into the street, because we had students all around, famously Art Honeyman, who used to trike around in his little, it was not a wheelchair in the traditional sense, it was a chair with 4 wheels, a little like that on it, and he would just scoot all over the place,
right.
and having to get from here to there over curbs. And so we had to fight with the city to get curb cuts. And of course now, they're all over the place, so we had a few little beginnings of that.
And the other student housing development that happened at that time was Dan Davis building what is now the Ondine,
Yes,
which then was the Viking. And that was a private development.
yes.
How did that come about?
He was a developer. He had a number of apartment houses around the city. I don't recall how many, but he was a reasonably wealthy person. And he came to visit one day and talk about that, and we encouraged him because, again, we had no statutory authority for that, and so he bought that block and built it. And it was in the days when I think we were just beginning or just into a very good growth of the Middle East Studies Center. And we had a lot of students who were from Saudi Arabia and Lebanon and mainly those two, I think, coming here. And they had the wherewithal to house themselves in a nice dormitory across the street. So that helped get that off the ground financially, I think. Anyway, it grew to the point that it was commercially successful.
And after you had been back on campus for quite a while, you had the opportunity to go back south to the Chancellor's office. What position did you hold back down there then?
I was Vice Chancellor for Personnel Administration. It was another one of those things that were starting. Again, through my affiliated organization, the Western Association of College University Business Officers, there was a week-long seminar in Denver about faculty collective bargaining that was just getting underway in the East Coast, mostly in Florida and some of the East Coast states. And I went to that, as did Dave Frohnmeyer, who was then on the law school faculty at U of O and legal assistant to the president. So we were both there. By happenstance, it wasn't planned that way. Anyway, Oregon legislature, I think in 1969 or 71, along in there someplace, adopted legislation to make it possible for public employees to bargain collectively. And the faculty at Southern Oregon State College decided they would like to form a faculty union. So that they made a petition for to the whatever the board was in those days that handled that at the state level. And the board's attorney, John Osborne, who was an assistant attorney general, but who was officed in Eugene, which was the chancellor's office, knew that I had been to that seminar. He called me up about a couple of things. And I said, oh, I'll have to look in my notes. Our department heads in the bargaining unit or out of the bargaining unit? I don't remember. I have to look at my notes. That kind of stuff. And so when that hearing on the establishment of the union at Southern Oregon came about, the chancellor and John Osborne invited me to go with them down there, and so I did. And on the way back, we were talking about what is bargainable. Chancellor Llewellyn didn't really know much about the extent of matters that could be bargained. And so we talked quite a while. And Lou said, we don't have anybody to do that. And then he asked when the state had a personnel division employee who was their specialist in union organization and conducting the election and so on, who was an attorney. And Lou asked him, what kind of a person you need for that? He said, well, someone who's familiar with higher education, who has higher education finance and some experience in negotiating. And Lou said, that sounds like you. And I said, no. But some months went by and they voted to be represented, and so then Lou had to face it. And so he asked the president if I could take a couple of months to come down and organize an office for that purpose. And I did, but it developed. I was asked to take the job, and I did.
And you were there during another interesting time on campus when a president from Southern Oregon took over at Portland State, a man named Natalie Sicaro.
Yeah.
And we could just say he was not unanimously popular among faculty here and ran into a lot of problems, and was later basically asked to seek other avenues of employment. And at that point you were acting, I believe, acting chancellor, or?
No, I was chancellor for a year, but I specifically.
Is that like king for a day?
Yes, exactly.
Cool.
Bud Davis had left.
Right.
To go to LSU as president, and I just had my little bachelor's degree, and so there knew I wasn't going to be the guy. But I was asked to serve as chancellor while the search went on for one more properly qualified. And I said to the board, don't tag me with that acting adjective, because people just say, well, we don't have to pay attention to him, he's just acting.
Right.
And so they agreed. So I said, okay, I'm the chancellor. Doesn't make any difference in sense whether you're acting or whether you're just psychological to me. And so that's how I had that position for a year.
I don't want to.
1987, 88, I think it was.
Yes. And we don't need to get into the confidentiality of the negotiations of contracts and so on, but when Mr. Sickrow was asked eventually to leave, through a series of hearings that I assume you had organized here on campus, and then you needed to select a president, and you, for Portland State, an interim or an acting.
Yeah.
You selected a man, Roger Edgington, who was the business guy on campus.
Yeah.
Can you?
He was my successor.
Can you tell me about your thinking, why he was the choice rather than an academic, quote unquote?
Yes, I think my memory is that the person in the academic affairs office, the chief academic officer at that time, I didn't believe was suitable for that position. And I didn't want to start raising any precedents of a person moving in from that position and then having the inside track to become the president on a more continuing basis. I thought Roger had already demonstrated his ability to care for the institution. He was steady. He was not one who got excited about things. And I thought that he was well suited in terms of personality and in terms of his experience here, commitment to the institution, to serve that for, and like me in my 1 year position, he didn't expect to be the president on a continuing basis, so I thought that was the best solution for that at that particular point in time.
Well, I think many of us who were on campus at that time were surprised, but later came to realize that he was, as you said, he was a steady hand at the wheel, and
Yeah.
there had been a lot of animosity on campus, which gradually, I think, gradually dissipated over the time he served as president, because there weren't a lot of factions.
Yes. Well, that's what you have to avoid, of course, that's.
So, I'd like to know, I know when I first, every time I come down to the campus now, I still am amazed at the difference between now and when I first came on campus as a student in '61, I think it was. What do you think about when you, other than not being able to find a parking place, what do you think about when you see this place with 28,000 students and reaching clear down to the auditorium now? And
Same thing you do, it's astonishing. It's, I don't have to compare it to 1961, and you compare it to 3 years ago or 5 years ago, and you know, every time you come here, there's a crane over here and a crane over there, and it's really kind of developing the way that we generally thought in the Skidmore and and Merrill long-term plan, not precisely by any means, but just in the general way. And it's heartwarming to see that, of course, for me,
Sure.
because it's been, even when I was away for 15 years, this was still in here.
Yes, and all those years of saying a city like Portland really needed an institution, the word seems finally to have reached the campuses in the South now, which U of O and OSU both have facilities in the city now.
Yes.
What, should we be worried about that?
I don't think so. The Board of Higher Education, of course, in its initial formulation in 1929 was to I shouldn't say eliminate, but limit duplication of courses on other campuses, or not courses, major fields of study, degree programs. I'll get it right in a minute. So, University of Oregon has wanted to have architecture, for example, as one of their programs in Portland, because this is where the architectural profession of the state is. And yet they're down 120 miles south or whatever. And so it was fighting that, or resisting it, as one might say, that the board's position on duplication made it hard for us to have a architecture program, for example, and other things of that sort. So, on the other hand, I think I'm really not familiar to the extent to which they have made a physical presence of importance other than for athletics and for other kind of meetings and just having a presence here where they're in the population center.
What do you think, based on your experience, of the relatively new organization in which each of the schools, the major universities, have their own boards now, and the traditional role of the state board isn't there anymore?
I think the earlier organization served its purpose particularly during a period of fast growth back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Since then, the state system really couldn't do its work as effectively because each of the institutions, including PSU, have had legislative relations staff. And in a sense, those go around the board. Everybody agrees to, and they still do, even without the Board of Higher Education, to cooperate in their legislative requests and programs to support each other, which is necessary. If not a good thing, it's a necessary thing.
Right.
So I don't have any objection to that. I think it gives the institutions, of course, more latitude and gives it permits it to have a sense of purpose and identification that's not as easy under that other operating format. But the fear is, of course, early on that Oregon and Oregon State had these well-established alums who had the ability to be major contributors, where Portland State had many thousands, but we're out there still working as working people. And, you know, they're good, strong, middle-class people, but we didn't have a string of millionaires like, or even near millionaires like many of the professionals who came out of those other institutions. But having reached a larger plateau now, I forgot what the president said, 100,000 alums right in the city of Portland, I think he said.
That's correct.
And I don't know the total number now, 150, 170, somewhere in that range. Makes that an easier situation for PSU to work with. One of the things that I wish we could have done was get the Northwest School of Law when we had that opportunity, but the board squashed that real quickly. And of course, that's one of the strengths of the U of O's.
The law school.
Is,
Well, and Lewis and Clark got that law school.
and they've done well.
It's done very well. They have basically their own campus up there.
When was that opportunity? Portland, you're saying Portland State, sorry.
Nope.
You're saying Portland State had the opportunity to absorb the Northwest School of Law?
Well, yes,
At what time was that?
I can't recall precisely. It would have been probably in the 1960s.
It was under Millar.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was in Millar's era, because the Northwest College of Law was, I shouldn't say failing, but it was struggling financially, and
Its history basically was early Portland State's history. It was
yes,
located downtown and rented space and
Right.
basically served a large proportion of returning World War II veterans who wanted to
Yeah.
become lawyers.
but now they're Lewis and Clark graduates on all the courts and the
Oh,
and the
yes.
appellate courts and other places there, so they're strong. But
Just one more in a string of missed opportunities, Bill.
darn.
Is there any other things you need to get off your chest at this point?
No, I'm satisfied there. I want to get whatever you have in mind.
Can I ask, I always like to ask,
Surely.
I mean, you know, you said it's satisfying because Portland's, to see our ongoing growth because Portland State's always in your heart. I mean, I know you started at Vanport, but you were gone for a while and you were at another Oregon institution and then you were in the Chancellor's office. So what is it about Portland State that holds your heart over basically, I mean, your whole career as an adult? Your adult career, your professional career, what is it about us that let us hold on to you even when you weren't here?
I guess because I was part of the beginning of it, and it's just like family is part of it. As you say, it's my adulthood, really. I was, what was it, in 1950, I would have been 25 years old. I'm 93 now. And so it's just continues to be a part, because seeing it grow as we had hoped, as when we started as students and early staff and faculty members. So that's the main thing, I guess. That's just, and we've just built friends. Most of our lifelong friends have come out of this institution. And I've outlasted most of them for some reason, I don't know.
Well,
But
it's a clean living, probably.
good, clean living, you got it. Surely that's it.
Well, you know, Dean Acheson, who was Secretary of State under Truman, and some other, he wrote a book called Present at the Creation, in which he was talking about the creation of so-called New World Order after World War II.
Yeah.
But I think we could say the same about you and this institution. You were present at the creation, and that's probably why.
Virtually so, yeah.
Well, I also think it's unclear if we would be where we are if you
Oh.
hadn't been here, especially in that period
I
of
think that's
development,
true.
right, in the sixties and seventies.
I believe that my main contribution was the Urban Renewal Project, and that activity opened things up, and then everything that grew from that, and piece by piece and time over time. So others could have done it, but I happened to be the one that was here. So I was lucky. Someone said recently that luck is the intersection of preparation or preparedness and opportunity. And fortunately, have been in that situation a number of times where I had prepared, not specifically for something, but happened to have the preparedness. And when the opportunity came, it connected, and then I got lucky.
Well, somebody once said it's better to be lucky than good, but I think you were both, so.
Thank you very much. Been a pleasure.
Even though it meant Papa John's delicatessen had to go.
I know.
And
Yeah, there were several places
and
like
that-
that we used to go.
that older woman who had a
Oh,
little
yes,
coffee
okay.
shop. that-
Bianca's.
Bianca's, that's
Thanks
it.
you.
Yeah, I read about that.
Over in East Hall.
Yep.
Yep, she was in East Hall.
She- Well,
Oh, yeah, there are
that's
characters.
it. She used to, if you ordered soup, she used to have these little cans of Campbell's soup that she would often heat them up in a coffee maker. It was amazing. Piece of work. Hey,
Yeah, there's some delightful folks around here
Yeah.
over time.
that's right.
Did you have students who worked with you when you were working with the PDC? And
Working
or
with
when you were planning with the PDC and or with the architects for those Portland State plans, like when you were talking about the buildings, you know,
No, we did
the
not.
campus plans, you didn't have students contributing their
No, I don't think so.
into that? Yeah. So those
I
decisions
don't know
were made.
why.
Yeah, I mean, the only reason I ask is because I think that today, that would be, I mean, and I think students like Stan Amy are probably part of the legacy for that.
You bet.
That today they were definitely, I mean, even today when they do, you know, renovations at Smith Center, they take polls of students and, you know, faculty and staff, you know, campus
Oh,
community
well,
polls.
yeah, we would, I don't have any specific recollection of that,
Mhm.
but, some of that was held in confidence. Sounds a little overreaching, but it wasn't publicized very much when we were doing
Uh-huh.
some of those things, because they were sub rosa in a sense,
Right,
because we were actually making plans that were not congruent with what the position of the Board of Higher Education was, or the Chancellor's office.
right.
And the whole effort to make this an institution was, in a sense, that way, although it was not in those early days when people were swarming over Stateside, but a lot of folks going to the legislature, parents and students. That was obviously public
Right.
pressure. But some of the other plans had to be done, formulated at least in its initial stages, without participation of many
Mhm.
others.
I also think of that, or I'm really interested in that, or the urban renewal period, and I've done some studies on downtown revitalization and how urban renewal played a role not just in Portland, but in other cities in doing, you know,
Mhm.
clearing blight, and the impact, I mean, of course, there's been a lot of people doing historical study on how urban renewal programs in various parts of the city have impacted displacement of communities.
Sure.
particularly in Albina, like they use that same law that was amended that you mentioned for universities, colleges, and hospitals, created that project for Legacy Emmanuel, or for the Emmanuel Hospital over there that,
Mhm.
displaced a lot of the community in Albina. And so I thought it was interesting you brought that up, because that's definitely something that people are still looking at here that's not specific to Portland State. But anyway, I've been interested in seeing how within student media, how student media recorded the change from the on-campus community as housing was affected. Students living in these boarding houses, apartment buildings, and partaking of the mom and pop businesses that were still around the area in the early 60s, and then witnessing the demolition of that in order to create the campus. So this paradox between losing the community and creating the campus.
It
What are
was,
your
it
thoughts?
was hard for us, particularly along Broadway there. There were these 2 or 3 story houses, some with apartments, but all the lower street level were little businesses, cleaners, sewing shop, hair salon, or, those 2 little things like that were obviously the livelihood of those folks that we had to do.
Mm-hmm.
So eminent domain is a double-edged sword, and
Well, there's no resisting it.
I know, well, the ranchers along the Rio Grande River are resisting.
Yeah.
Right.
That'll be fun to see.
Yeah,
I guess.
I mean, it's kind of in terms of this, in the city, it's kind of the quintessential can't fight City Hall sort of dilemma with the eminent domain, but,
Yeah, that's part of what we had to do, though, is to fight City Hall
mhm.
on things like the bridges and the curb cuts, for example. That's the easy. And then when they start to get aboard and see the longer term of its effects of
Mhm.
how they can participate and for the good of the community, then it changes the whole attitude and makes things a little easier, I think, I hope.
Well, and it did seem to give downtown like eventually the university district, right, is what it became.
Yes.
Portland State, right?
Yeah, I
It
guess so.
contributed to the success of
It's
downtown.
formally, noted formally as the university district, I guess. I don't know what the boundaries are.
No one knows what the boundaries are.
Not anymore,
Are
right?
you?
Not anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to hop and skip, doesn't it?
Yeah, especially
Because-
since we have shared spaces now, right, with OHSU, right, if you think of down on the waterfront, and things like that, right? So there's a lot of collaborative spaces that are PSU spaces, but other people's spaces too.
Well, actually, that is one thing that is kind of missing here. If you go up to the University of Washington, at least when I was a student there, late 60s, but there really was a university district.
Yes,
You know, you knew
Yes.
you were in the U district
Yes.
because there were 2 major business streets that were several blocks long, and it was all university-related stuff,
yes.
bookstores and,
Clothing stores, and
Clothing
barber
stores,
shops, and,
yeah.
all that.
Businesses that students would use.
yeah. But that's not,
That's only just recently sort of been recovered here, I think. I mean, in terms of,
Well, Portland has these tiny little blocks, 200-foot blocks, 200-square-foot blocks.
that's right.
But it chops it up a lot
yeah,
more
makes downtown a
And-
little harder.
in this downtown area.
I mean, since you had experience on a couple different campuses, did you observe that having the student housing in the on campus and it made a difference in terms of that community on campus for, I mean, did you witness that? Like, as far as having it, I don't know how to describe this, it's sort of indescribable, but to have it feel more like students come to school and it's this academic environment and sort of set apart from the city in its own. Did you feel that happened at Portland State as housing either left here or returned here?
I don't really, I can't really say that it did, because I think, in the first place, it was so limited in the beginning that if it were 3% of the students or 5%, it wasn't enough to really change the whole ambiance or the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And again, the fact that everything here is so chopped up, other than the park blocks,
Mm-hmm.
there's little continuity
Yeah.
in businesses and activities that are unrelated to the campus. They're not part of it, physically a part of it. So, I don't know.
That's a good point. I hadn't really thought about that. The way the public streets, except for the two park streets, they're still viable streets. And that just cuts the campus up much more than most campuses.
Oh, yes. Yeah, there's,
And I remember we used to fought like heck to get a crossing signal on Broadway. In fact, the students drew their own crosswalks on Broadway because it was so difficult to get across. But
Is that right?
now there are traffic lights all over.
yes.
But it's an interesting idea, the impact of housing or lack of housing, right? Because somewhere like OSU now can require its entire incoming class to live in student housing. Right, so you can
Yes.
force sort of that sort of massive change
Yes.
of the culture if you know, but that's obviously never been, even with new student housing, that's both not an option for us and also not it's kind of counter to our appeal in the middle of the city, right? I mean, that's not necessarily what our students
It's always
want.
been a commuter college.
Right, yeah.
And always will be in one sense, because so many of the students, well, look at the average age, look at the number of students who have children, for goodness
Right.
sakes.
Right.
And I don't know of any downtown type campus that has adequate accommodation for students with kids,
Right, right.
whether they're married or single, or doesn't make much difference. So it's, I think it's always gonna be different in that respect.
Yeah.
Right. And it should be, I mean.
Yeah.
But I'm always amazed, one of the things that always strikes me when I come down here is the disparate age and the culture, the ethnic differences that one sees
Yeah.
is palpable.
Well, I think the average age has come down, but not very much. It's still, the average age of the student body here is still in the higher 20s, as I recall.
I think it came from down from 28 to 26,
Yeah.
maybe,
Mhm.
so it's a
Yeah.
slight decrease, but, yeah. And we are the most diverse campus in Oregon
don't doubt
at this
that.
point.
Yeah, I can't question that at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Bill, this is
Thank you.
the third time you've been willing to sit down and talk to us on camera, so we really appreciate your
I hope it was.
stamina and patience and willingness
Well,
to do that.
That's the easy part. Getting this thing to work is the
Yeah.
hard part.
Well, in 2 more years, we'll probably come up with more questions we have to ask you.
I'll be, if I'm here, I'll be pleased to answer,
Thank you.
if my brain works. It's